Hi, I'm Callum from Retro Power. Since 2020 we've been doing a weekly walk around our workshop called the Uncut series, where we show the progress on the various projects we're working on. We thought it would be really cool if we edited together all the segments that relate to each individual project into one series, so you can actually follow the build of an individual project start to finish. So that's what we've done. Welcome to the Dream Car Build series. The humble Vauxhall Chevette. We've obviously built one of these before, as you saw in last week's episode. We were looking at the rally car that we built, which was actually the inspiration for this customer to book this project in. So what he wants is a sort of road orientated version of that car. So it's going to be the wide arched HSR body kit that they use on the rally cars. In fact, it's the extra wide kit where the rear arches are even wider. It's going to have a similar spec Vauxhall C20XE engine, which will do to virtually the same spec as the other one, so it should make around 280, 290 horsepower. Quaife 6-speed sequential gearbox. That's going to be mated up to an Atlas fully floating axle, which is kind of the go-to setup for a Mark II Escort rally car. And it's just because everything is so easily available for Escort in the rallying scene, it makes sense to transfer a lot of that over to the builds like this, like a Chevette. So we'll have the Atlas axle in there. We're going to have alloy front hubs, which are made to the Ford PCD. So it'll be Ford PCD all the way around, so 4x108 PCD. And then we're just going to do, a great suite of electronics on it. So it's going to have a Motec digital dash, Motec engine ECU, Motec PDU, which manages all the electrical systems on the car. Relatively stripped out, not as hardcore as the rally car that we built. It's going to have a cage, but slightly less intrusive cage. It's going to have some degree of interior, so we'll probably have a headlining in it and some carpet to just try and keep the noise down a little bit in there. But it's kind of that sort of rally car for road use as a toy, basically, for the guy we're building it for. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing this come together, because these kind of stripped back motorsport builds are such a kind of contrast to the complicated builds like the Mercedes projects. And it's just a totally different set of challenges and rewarding in a different way. You can get in this at the end of it and just feel like an absolute lunatic hooning down the country lanes in it. Whereas the Mercedes projects are just fantastic projects to just waft along in. So they're totally opposite ends of the spectrum, and projects that we're equally enthused about. So really looking forward to getting this moving. Next week we should be blasting this, stripping the rest of the parts off it, blasting it, and then we'll be able to make a start on the metalwork. So let's have a little walk this way. A lot of my work over the last week or two has actually been ordering parts for that Chevette project, because when we do the metalwork, there's obviously going to be an amount of rust repair, but then we're fairly quickly going to be into the dry build stage on it, where we're going to need the engine ancillaries, the gearbox, the axle, and even to the extent of needing quite a lot of electrical parts and components like that, where we'll be planning out where they're going to be mounted. So it's important to get a lot of that hardware ordered now. We move on to a Chevette hatchback, which you saw looking very yellow last week, and it's now looking bare metal now. This is literally just finished blasting this, so it is as you see it. There's bits of rust on it, we know that. I'll spin it over in 2 seconds and show you how what seems like an almost brand new shell suddenly looks a lot less brand new when you strip it down. This is an extremely good Chevette body shell. As they go, it's extremely good. But it's worth bearing in mind that what people will say is a perfect shell and what looks absolutely immaculate can suddenly look a little bit less immaculate when you actually strip it down. An interesting one for any anoraks out there that might be able to shed any light on it. The car was an automatic. The fitment of the auto tunnel into the shell looks quite Heath Robinson. It looks to me like that was simply cut out with a gas torch. Anybody know whether that was actually how they were done? I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, because I don't imagine the market was enormous for Chevette autos. So were they just gas cut out from a standard non-auto shell by GM at the factory,
or was that an aftermarket modification? But I suspect it was factory. I've got no reason to think the car's ever been changed. It didn't look like it ever had, but I'd be interested to know. Certainly all the sealer and paint above it looked factory. So, but it was interesting if that was the factory modification was to just gas torch out a section and weld that in. That's quite interesting. Yeah, spinning the car over. There'll be a little bit of dust now. It's crushed glass media that we blast the shell with, which is now raining on me quite a lot. That's gone quite tight. I'll pull that over as far as I can. As you can see, along the inner wing, down the A panel, across the bottom of the A post, all going to need repair that side. Similar the other side, round the front panel, all similar, all going to need a reasonable amount of repair. Yeah, it's crushed glass media we use. There's a close-in of that. It's recycled bottle glass. That's what we blast the car with. It's the best media, in my opinion, for stripping a body shell back to bare metal. It cuts reasonably fast, so the blasting operation is relatively quick. It carries very little weight. It's not massively high density, so it doesn't carry too much weight, which then can cause distortion in the panels. And it's also cost effective. It's relatively cheap. And you can't use sand because that would be silly. It has free silica in it. It's very dangerous to your health, gives you silicosis and all sorts of other nasty things which you don't want. The other benefit, going back to the speed of cut with glass, is that the fact that it cuts fast is actually it's a major benefit. The softer, sort of more gentle media, you end up having to blast for longer to get the surface clean. And actually, the fact there are more gentle media is often self-defeating, in that you end up blasting for longer to get the surface clean, and then that actually can give rise to distortion through the hammering effect and the temperature rise of the surface as you're doing it. Basically, in simple terms, I wouldn't consider using any other media for general blasting on a body shell where there is corrosion present. I wouldn't use another media other than crushed glass, really, for this sort of job. Crushed plastic, phenolic plastic media is very good for paint removal on surfaces where you've got to be gentle, just as an aside. The aircraft industry use it quite a lot. The crushed plastic media is very expensive by comparison to this, so it's not really in keeping with trying to keep the cost reasonable on this sort of job. But it is very good for stripping paint off a panel like that, where it's a big flat, big simple panel with no corrosion. Plastic media would be better there, but it would be quite difficult to mix both types of media. So in reality, crushed glass is great. But yeah, in terms of the car, we're going to need repair on the inner wing, repair around here, standard Chevette places. It's going to need sills. It's had wheel arches. That doesn't really matter because they're cut out for tubs anyway for the HSR body kit to go on. I don't know what the rear corners look like. I'm going to walk along while Jamie's filming and have a look because I've not actually looked yet. Pretty good. A little bit gone down here. A little bit on the inner arch there, but nothing too drastic. It all looks very, very honest as Chevettes go. The inner sill's gone at the back, the outer sill's gone at the back. Standard Chevette fare. I don't think I've seen one where they've not needed repair, to be honest. The roof where the hatch mounts is all good, so no problems there. Rear end generally looks very good indeed. Yeah, as Chevettes go, that's about as good as they get these days, I think. But it's interesting to point out that, about as good as they get is still already generally repaired, and certainly in need of repair. But yeah, this is now going to be blown out, hoovered out. We'll put the extraction back on, get the water back on and the extraction back on, get this blown out, get it hoovered out, all cleaned. Then we'll put a very light coat of etch primer on it just to stop any flash rusting. To be honest, it's almost unnecessary because a lot of the car is going to be cleaned back anyway, and we will re-blast the car post-metal work anyway. So all vehicles we do are blasted twice. This is just a clean-up blast at this stage. Yes, Jamie's just reminded me to point out, I had kind of skipped over that. We've already, we mix the process up a little bit depending on the car, and depending on the type of damage stroke undercoating present, but this had pretty much just factory underseal on it plus a few areas that had been touched up. On a car with factory underseal and factory sealer that hasn't had gross levels of touching up on the underseal, we'll generally burn them ourselves using a blowtorch and a scraper and just heat and scrape that off. Any of the harder, more brittle bits we'll sort of just scrape off, we'll ping them off and scrape them off. Softer materials will tend to heat and scrape those off. And that's necessary because the media will just bounce off the soft materials. So you can't blast them off. You just smear them around with a blaster if you try and blast them. You need to scrape those off first. So yeah, we would scrape all that sealer off and remove all that first. Then blast the car to get it back to bare metal like this. And then we'll put a very light coat of etch primer on to prevent flash rusting, and then it's going to go through there and it's going to sit on the jig. We're not actually going to jig it just yet because most of the suspension pickups are being altered anyway, so there's no point really bolting to the suspension pickups, but we're going to then fit it to the jig that the Mustang's just come off. And Scott's going to carry on with the metalwork. He made a little start on removing excess brackets and starting to make the repair sections yesterday. He's going to carry on with that tomorrow, and then we'll progress with the metalwork. We're now eagerly awaiting a big pile of bits. We've got a very large delivery coming from Camillus Bradley Motorsport with a fully floating Atlas axle for the rear, a Quaife sequential box to go in the middle, various other suspension parts. Most of the rear suspension is going to be as per Group 4 Escort, so most of the bits to do with that are coming from Camillus as well. So when that lot turns up, we'll be building that into the fabrication agenda.
Next one, the Chevette. So last week we saw that being blasted and prepared for metalwork. So we've now got this mounted on our jig, and we've just made the first steps into rust repair. So we've started with this inner wing. We've done a whole new wing top rail here, repaired this section where the headlight is, done a repair lower down the pillar here. We've taken this reinforcer off here, which I think was actually taken off before blasting, so we could make sure the area under it was blasted and cleaned up, and so we'll make a new reinforcer to go on there. And we're just going to carry on plodding through the rust repair on it, which is the first step really. And once we've done all the rust repair, we'll then start on doing the modification work on the shell and the dry build with all the mechanical parts. And that's something that's been happening this week. I think I spoke last time about a lot of my time was ordering parts. Well, a lot of those parts have started to come now. So big delivery came yesterday from Camillus Bradley in Ireland. That would be a fully built, fully floating Atlas rear axle, which is an axle normally used in Mark II Escort rally cars, but it's just a great go-to axle because everything is available new. It's a strong axle. So we've gone for an axle built by him. It's left in just a bare metal finish at the moment because we need to decide exactly the spacing for the location brackets on it and fully weld those on. They've just been left tacked by him. Once we've done that, we'll strip it all apart, powder coat the casing, and then put it all back together again for the final time. We got a Quaife 6-speed sequential gearbox from him, Tilton pedal box, so we've gone for a floor mount Tilton box with the cylinders back under your heels, so there'll be like a false floor section under your heels that cover the master cylinders. The Quaife sequential will be mated to a Vauxhall C20XE, or red top as most people call it. Which we're going to have a dummy engine to use for our mock-up build while the actual engine is built. So one thing that's going to be arriving shortly will be all the ancillary parts, so the dry sump pan, the throttle bodies, the alternator, starter motor, basically all the external parts that affect space in the engine bay. So we can just get our dummy engine, bolt all those parts on, get it in there with the gearbox, get it all mounted up, and then start planning the fabrication work in the engine bay to suit. We've got the wheels from Camillus as well, so Revolution 5 spokes, a fairly traditional choice for a rally car in the UK. We're going to refinish them in a different colour further down the line, but for the moment we'll leave them in the white finish that they came while we're doing all the mock-up build. What else did we get? We got all the link brackets for the axle, so the axle's going to be 5 linked. It'll have boxes fabricated into the body shell at the back there and then tied into a cross member that we will fabricate, which sits across roughly at the front of where the original seat base used to be in the back. and then it'll be 4 trailing arms and a panhard rod. Again, fairly standard setup for an escort rally car, and that transfers over quite nicely to the Chevette. Now the works Chevette cars had a different setup, so the grey car that we built previously, which was a competition build, had the works setup, which is where the spring pans actually sit onto the lower arm, so you have a very strong lower arm, still 4-link but with a very strong lower arm, that the spring, a separate spring rather than a coilover, sits directly onto, and then just the damper sits into the turret at the back. Whereas on this one, because we're not trying to meet any sort of historic specs with it, we're just going with coilovers into a fabricated turret, much like you would on a Mark II Escort Group 4 rally car. Another thing of note is that on the other competition car we built, it had a longer wheelbase, which was something that the works cars had. They added around 100mm in the wheelbase, essentially cut the chassis leg behind the front crossmember and extended it forward and refabricated the inner wing to bring the front crossmember around 100mm further forward, to give the car a longer than standard wheelbase, which we did on the other car, but we're not going to do on this. This is essentially a road toy, so we're doing it fairly rally spec, but without any of the things that you'd need to do to make it as per an original works rally car, because they're just unnecessary to do. You know, it would be excessive work for a car that's not trying to meet any sort of historic regulations. So yeah, lots of parts arriving, rust repair underway, and very shortly we'll be getting on to the more exciting work of starting to do all the fabrication regarding axle location, engine, gearbox, etc. So excited to see this one taking shape. We've been carrying on with the rot repair. So I think Scott had just done this section here last week. He did a little bit of repair on the headlamps around that side and on the back of the inner wing where the reinforcing box is. There's a reinforcer box which is missing from this side at the minute. On that side it wasn't rotten, but we decided to take it off so we could clean up any surface rust inside it, protect it with some epoxy primer and then weld it back on. There was a little bit of rot in this corner, the other side to repair, which has been done. And at the moment he's working on this sill, so that sill is actually not going to be replaced. It's just a little repair at the front which we've done. This side we're replacing the whole outer sill, which is an available panel, and then all the inner structure we're repairing. So Scott's been working on this reinforcer panel, which is essentially the lower section of the inner quarter panel here, which forms a reinforcer that drops down and ties into where the outer sill meets the inner, and then a whole section of inner sill here, which is just in the process of making at the moment. So once we've done that, inner in, reinforcer in, and then the new outer sill will go on, and then there'll be a little bit of rust repair to do on this corner. The new sill kind of comes around here, so it includes that, but we'll have a bit to do on the pillar there, and then just this corner section here. That'll be more or less the last of the rust repair. And then we start to move on to the more exciting fabrication, and on that sort of front, I've been measuring up to start looking at the location for the boxes that will hold the trailing arms for the axle. So that was really a case of establishing the axle centre line fore and aft and marking that out. So I've marked that out in various places on the shell and on the jig. The beauty of having the shell on a jig like this and levelled is you can then use a self-levelling laser to pick up all these lines and throw them across the whole car to mark the other side. We then established the axle centre line at ride height vertically, and I've marked that out on the shell as well. And from that information and the length of the links, the separation between the link mounting points and the axle centre lines, we've established a height for the top of the link box at the front, the height of the link box at the back of the box, and the fore and aft front point. So we're in the process of then marking out where we're going to cut to put those link boxes in. But there will be a reasonable amount of metalwork cut out as well, because the way these were originally, they've got the spring pans underneath, which we don't need anymore. The structural section that runs up there is going to be digging into the space where we want to put our link box. So we're going to be removing quite a lot. We also need to make more space for the diff to get a bit more axle travel. So the chances are we're going to cut out a good chunk of this over axle area, refabricate that, modify those chassis rail box sections there and tie them into our new link box housings. We'll also be tying this into where the main hoop cage feet come down, and then we'll also introduce a cross member as well to strengthen the shell crossways. So that will probably be next week's progress. We'll be making a start on all of this fabrication work back here, because really what we want to do is get the axle location and axle provision work done. Then we can get the cage in and tie the cage into that structure. Then with the cage in, we'll look at the seat mounts, because this cage dictates or has an influence on the clearance for the seats. So the cage in, seats will go in, do the seat mounting rails, then we can look at pedal position, steering column position, and then sort of start working through. We've also got we've made a start on stripping the engine down, so we're going to have just a dummy block and head. We've got the ancillary parts for that: dry sump pan, dry sump pump, and throttle bodies and various bolt-on ancillaries that affect the physical size of it. We've got the bell housing to make that up to the quaif, so another area of progress is likely to be getting all that bolted up together and slung into place, so we can then look at what fabrication we're going to have to do on the tunnel and in the engine bay. I'm actually hoping not much in the tunnel, because it's an auto. This was an auto, which means it's got a really big tunnel anyway, so I'm thinking we won't have to do a lot of work in the tunnel, which will be good.
So, progress in here is on various fronts. The first of which we'll talk about is the Chevette. The goings on here have been some dry build work and various bits of metal work. In terms of dry build, the engine and gearbox, or a mock-up engine block with dry sump pan attached and an empty cylinder head attached. That's been bolted onto the bell housing and onto the Quaif 60G gearbox. And they've been offered in this morning, and the cross member's been put in this morning. That was steam cleaned off this morning. That's also gone in, just standard as it came out of the car when it came here, really, at the moment, other than being cleaned. That's been offered in so that we can work out the engine and transmission mounts for the particular positioning that the engine's having in this car. We've done these in the past, but for various reasons, the mounts are not always the same, depending on application. So we're going to make these mounts to suit this application. We bought some Group 4 Escort 4 link boxes for the car. Having checked those over and gone, basically the rear suspension on the car is loosely Escort based. It's not possible to use the exact Escort link boxes. I offered them in. They're a little bit short in a couple of places for the ride height that we want to run on the car, with the links run at the angles we want to run them at. The link boxes are actually slightly short to reach the floor that they've got to fit to. And it wasn't really worth modifying them, so I've just drawn up some more and then profiled out, cut and fabricated some more link boxes to accurately fit the floor. So they're now all welded in. I've made the rear turrets. We're fitting for the rear turrets. We're fitting those into the original cutouts in the floor of the car. The Chevette hatches had a floor based on the Chevette saloon, which was fitted with turrets from the factory. On the hatch, they fitted blanking plates into where the turrets were fitted on the saloon, just to block the holes. So on these, we've taken those blanking plates out, and I then fabricate turrets. Rather than doing the full long travel turrets that they would have used on the gravel spec cars, I'm using a slightly smaller turret, as this is only going to be a tarmac use car, which I'm going to fit to the original inner arch apertures. So I've fabricated those turrets, or shaped those turrets. Scott's removed the original blanks, and they're ready to then fit into those blanks. Scott's finished repairing the A-pillar, finished the front footwell area in the bottom of the bulkhead, the repairs needed there. We're still waiting for a sill, hence the big gap down the side of the car. That's holding things up a little bit now, because we're awaiting the sill. We are going to continue getting the engine and gearbox mounts done, and then the next step really inside is to start work on the roll cage. Because the main hoop feet are going to tie into the chassis rail sections and the link boxes and the fabricated section that goes across between the main hoop uprights. So all that's got to tie together in there. So one of the next steps will be fitting the roll cage.